Greetings and welcome to the show. Our show today is about racial change in our neighborhoods. What happens? Why? Our guest has studied this issue and has looked at one neighborhood to find out why. Our guest today is Dr. Edward Orser, who is Professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Dr. Orser, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
Thank you very much for coming, First of all, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your studies?
Well, I'm a professor of American Studies at UMBC. I do courses on community and urban studies. Race is a particular concern of mine. I think we often, perhaps we don't realize enough that virtually all research is autobiographical, that we tend to obviously research things that are important to us. In some cases that may be something from the ancient world, or it may be a particular topic in science. But I think if we look closely, we see that things that we do research are things that we care about. And I care a lot about the state of our neighborhoods and about the issue of race relations in American society today.
All right. I know that your studies have turned into at least one book, and that's one of the reasons why I ask you here today. Could you tell us a little bit about that book and how and why you wrote it?
All right, the book is Blockbusting in Baltimore, which was published by the University Press of Kentucky. It's now available in paperback at a bookstore near you, I hope. But yes, let me say a little bit about why I taught it. And again, it is somewhat autobiographical. A lot of my own research actually grows out of my teaching and my interacting with my students. And I found in talking with my UMBC students, most of whom are from the central Maryland area, that race and the history of race is something that's so important in terms of them and their family's experience, but something that just isn't talked about enough. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. I typically have students do an oral history interview with their family members. And in one particular class some years ago, it just was quite clear that one of the untold stories, really untapped stories in their family history, had to do with the kinds of dynamics that I described in that book. That is, the kind of massive racial change that occurred in Baltimore, but really in American cities, in the late 40s and the 50s into the 60s, really a 1 or 2 decade period that really rewrote the shape of our cities. And the legacy of that story is still very much with us, and it clearly was very much with them. Sometimes almost unstated in these family histories, because the histories would be histories of white families that had fled in the process of the kind of change that occurred then. Or it might be the experience of African American families who went through that process, who perhaps moved into neighborhoods only to see whites in the neighborhood flee from their presence. And there was a lot of pain, a lot of anger buried in that experience, and I felt it's something that we really haven't faced up to, we really haven't understood. And if in fact it was simply a matter of something that happened in the past that needed to be kind of looked at and then we could move on, that's one thing, but it clearly is very much affecting our present too. In some ways we don't see residential patterns that different, even though we're talking about a period 40 years later and we like to think that racial attitudes have changed a lot.
So you really got into this because of understanding that when public policy does something, or when economics happens, that affects people. It affects people in ways that we don't understand, and frankly in ways that are not really covered in the newspaper.
Well, you know, feminists talk about the personal being political, and in a way what I'm suggesting is the personal is social, that these individual stories do add up to something. They add up to a picture that really needs to be looked at. But what happens, I think, so often is that we simply see the story as it affects us, and we don't really know the whole situation.
Great. Well, I'm glad you could come on the show today and talk about that. Could you talk a little bit about the neighborhood that you studied?
Let me say a little bit about that. Actually, on the basis of those early reports from my students and our thinking about them, I felt a need to go and look at the census data to see, in fact, just what had really happened in neighborhoods like Edmondson Village. I selected Edmondson Village because it's on the west side. Many of my students come from the west side, both the city and the county and surrounding counties. I could have chosen other neighborhoods in Baltimore or indeed in other cities. Edmondson Village is a particularly is perhaps an extreme case of something that happened, but it's by no means the whole story.
And it's also, I would think, similar to what has happened in certain parts of Baltimore County and certain parts of Anne Arundel County and other.
Absolutely,
every jurisdiction in our state.
So it really becomes kind of a case study, but this is not in a sense to pick on Edmondson Village or to say that it's unique. I mean, part of the thing that's really important is to see how pervasive this phenomenon was. But I went and looked at the census data and I found, yeah, the students were really right and my own instincts were really right. This is a neighborhood that in 1955 was virtually all white. And in 1965, it was virtually all African American. 10-year period, total racial turnover, near total racial turnover. And what I found myself doing was then taking that data and then going into a situation, let's say a classroom, and say, imagine a community of 10,000 people, because that was one of the census tracts, was 10,000 people. Really, the whole area was more like 20,000 people. But imagine an area of 10,000 people, and in 1 year consists of that group of people. 10 years later, it's still 10,000 people, but none of the people are almost, well, I think in the example I say none of the people are the same. And people scratch their heads. You know, they say, well, there must have been an earthquake. Right. Or a volcano or a flood. They talk about natural, right? some kind of natural cause. And those, of course, we know those disasters occur at times with tragic consequences, but can you imagine that everybody was wiped out and 10 years later there's a new community in place and everybody is new? And people begin to say, well, that's probably not too likely. So then someone says economic disaster. It was a company town or a one industry town. The industry went belly up. New industry came in later. There are 10,000 new people. And you begin to think, well, that's not very plausible. It might be plausible that the company folded and many people left. It's not too likely that a new industry came in and suddenly employed 10,000, or the parents in 10,000 families, and that all of a sudden you have a totally new community. So people begin to think, well, economic cause is probably not like that. And people have other ideas. They'll say, well, maybe it was wartime. It was a military community. You know, there are various explanations that sort of for a moment seem semi-plausible till people think about them. And then there'll be a hand that will sort of creep up in the back of the room and someone will say, could this have been racial change? And then everybody settles back and says, oh, yeah. Now, I think that's incredible. I think that says something just absolutely incredulous about American society, that race is such a powerful factor, and we recognize it to be so powerful that it is a single explanation that would account for change on the scale we're talking about. That not natural disaster, not economic disaster would account for it, but race would.
And that's why we have to talk about it, and that's why the President's initiative on race is so important, because it is so powerful.
But it's so unresolved, I think, in people's minds. I think it's such a difficult thing to talk about. I think there are all too few interracial conversations about it. And like my students' families, I think very often it remains kind of buried in personal histories.
I think your book is very important for many reasons. One reason is that it shows, I believe, that transition and the impact of racial change and what actually some forces did to make that change harder for some people than others. Could you walk us through the neighborhood as it was and as it became, please?
Okay, I often feel that in some ways part of why I told this story as a history is because I felt a tremendous need to try to understand what had happened. I was drawn to that moment, that 10-year period, 55 to 65, and in my book I have a chart that shows that neighborhood and how the very first African-American presence began in the southeastern corner near the Gwynns Falls Valley, for those of you who know the neighborhood, in 1955. Moved rapidly from southeast to northwest across Edmondson Avenue and then up toward Edmondson Village, up to near the Rocknell Heights area, which is the far northwest area. And by 1965, that racial change process was virtually complete. So that's really a very dramatic process that occurred there. happened so rapidly, and obviously right away you want to know, well, why did it happen? We, of course, know, I mean, none of us are naive about the history of race in America and residential patterns, so sort of general patterns of segregation aren't any big surprise to us. And the movement of whites often away from areas of African-American residency are not a great surprise to us either, although perhaps they're troubling, but they're not a surprise. But were there particular circumstances? Why did change happen this fast in this neighborhood? And that was part of what I was really curious to see. Was there something about this group of whites? Was there something about other factors that were involved? As I looked into the history of this group of whites, I found they were a very, quote-unquote, typical middle-income group of people who had moved in the 20s and 30s looking for a better life in what then was the suburbs. And I think very often we don't think of an area, a row house area in particular, as the suburbs, but it was in the 20s and 30s. It was the edge of the city. It was a movement out, away from more congested and older sections of the city. It was a move into a nicer kind of a housing situation. The row houses that James Keelty built, and he was the primary developer of the area, were the new daylight type in which every room had a window. They had little front yards, they had backyards, some trees. They sat up on a hill that overlooked the city. There was the Gwynns Falls Ravine with its trees and with developing Gwynns Falls Park and later Leakin Park. It really was a movement out to a much, quote-unquote, better style of suburban living. Also, the 20s and 30s houses now had central heating. They had new kitchens. They eventually put garages because people wanted to have cars. It's interesting, the advertisements in the 20s said, come out on the so-and-so car, by which they meant streetcar, which was really interesting. They expected people to arrive by streetcar, but then they advertised that they had garages. So obviously the hope was that you, before long, would have a car.
But we're talking about real well-equipped suburban housing.
Oh, very nice houses with quality features. So this was a real move out for people who had lived in older parts of the city. They were not affluent people. But they were not low-income people. They were very middle-income people. They were upper blue-collar and sort of solid white-collar. There were very few professional people. There were very few people who were people of wealth by any means. This is a very typical, I guess that's what I want to say, a very typical middle-income white group of people. I don't, by the way, think that they were any more prejudiced or racist than any other group of white people in American society, and that's really important. Who were the bad guys here?
Right.
I think it's really important to understand that this was a group of people who had very typical attitudes and very represented, I think, in many ways, mainstream white America, which means in the 20s and 30s that, like many other white Americans, they did not consider the possibility of racial integration. That was not something that they had ever given thought to. It was not something they ever really considered feasible or desirable. And whether they did or not, it wasn't something that they thought was likely to happen.
So I guess that explains their reaction to what subsequently happened.
Well, exactly. They had grown up in a world in which you simply didn't associate with African Americans in school, in home, in social settings. Perhaps you might in business operations, or you might in transportation or some other settings. But simply the notion of racial exclusivity was very much part of their world. They had no expectation that things would change.
Right.
It was simply that was the way it would be.
And I know that the title of your book is revelatory of one of the major forces in this rapid change.
Well, it is. Blockbusting in Baltimore, perhaps a provocative title, but I think we need to see that the way in which blockbusters operated in this situation, in fact, did pour gasoline on the fire. That may not be the best analogy, because maybe we might say the fire hadn't started, but they may have even tried to start the fire. But what blockbusters